The trip had been Shane's idea. "It'll be fun," he'd said, grinning as he unfolded the map on my kitchen table. "Just a couple of nights in the woods. Fresh air, campfires, no distractions." In hindsight, I wish we'd said no. There were 4 of us. Shane, always the leader. Emily, his girlfriend, who was equal parts sweet and sarcastic. Marcus, the quiet one who always seemed to blend into the background. And me, Jason, the guy who usually went along with things just to keep the peace. The plan was simple. Drive to Ravens Hollow, a remote stretch of forest 2 hours from town, hike a few miles in, and camp by the lake. We packed light tents, sleeping bags, a cooler of food, and a couple of flashlights. By the time we reached the trailhead, the late afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the gravel parking lot. "This place is beautiful," Emily said, stretching as she stepped out of the car. "Just wait until we get to the lake," Shane replied, slinging his backpack over one shoulder. The hike started off easy, the trail wide and well-marked. The woods were alive with the sounds of birds and the rustling of leaves in the warm summer breeze. But as we moved deeper into the forest, the trail grew narrower, the trees denser, their gnarled branches reaching out like claws. By the time we reached the lake, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky streaked with orange and purple. The lake was small but picturesque, its surface smooth and glassy, reflecting the darkening sky. We set up our tents near the water's edge, the smell of pine and damp earth heavy in the air. "Perfect spot," Shane said, tossing a log onto the growing pile of firewood. Marcus nodded, his eyes scanning the tree line. "It's quiet," he said softly. "Too quiet," Emily joked, elbowing him. We lit the fire as darkness fell, the flames crackling and sending sparks into the night. Laughter filled the air as we roasted marshmallows and swapped stories. For a while, it felt like nothing could go wrong. But then the first scream came. It was faint at first, almost drowned out by the crackling fire. A high-pitched, distant wail that carried through the trees like a ghostly echo. The laughter died instantly. "Did you hear that?" Emily asked, her voice tight. We all nodded, our eyes fixed on the dark forest beyond the firelight. "It's probably just an animal," Shane said, though his tone lacked confidence. We tried to shake it off, convincing ourselves it was nothing. But then the scream came again, louder this time, closer. It wasn't an animal. It was a child. "Someone's out there," Marcus said, his voice low. "But why would a kid be out here alone at night?" Emily asked, clutching Shane's arm. None of us had an answer. "Maybe they're lost," I said, standing up. "We should check it out." Shane hesitated, then nodded. "Grab a flashlight." We left Emily by the fire, her face pale in the flickering light, and headed into the woods. The trees closed in around us, the air growing colder with each step. "Hello," Shane called out, his voice cutting through the darkness. "Is someone there?" No response. The beam of the flashlight danced across the gnarled trunks, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move on their own. Then we heard it, a faint rustling, like something or someone moving through the underbrush. "Over there," Marcus whispered, pointing to the left. We followed the sound, our footsteps crunching on the dry leaves. But when we reached the spot, there was nothing there. "Maybe it was the wind," Shane said, though he didn't sound convinced. We turned back toward camp, the weight of unease settling over us. But as we approached the fire, we saw Emily standing, her back to us. She was staring at the trees, her body rigid. "Emily?" Shane called out, quickening his pace. She didn't move. When we reached her, she turned slowly, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. "What's wrong?" I asked, my heart pounding. She pointed to the ground near the fire, her hand trembling. We followed her gaze and froze. In the dirt beside the fire was a small, muddy footprint. It was too small to belong to any of us. "Someone was here," Emily whispered. We scanned the tree line, but the forest was silent, the firelight casting long shadows that danced across the ground. Shane picked up a stick from the fire, its end glowing red-hot, and held it like a weapon. "Whoever it was, they're gone now," he said, trying to sound confident. But none of us believed him. We sat in tense silence, listening to the sounds of the forest, every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves setting us on edge. Eventually, exhaustion overtook fear, and we retreated to our tents. But sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the scream, the rustling, the faint echo of footsteps in the woods. Just as I was drifting off, there was a loud crash outside my tent, a sound like something heavy falling. I bolted upright, my heart racing. "Guys!" I called out, unzipping the tent and stepping into the cold night air. The fire had burned low, casting weak light across the campsite. Shane, Emily, and Marcus were already outside, their faces pale and confused. "What was that?" Emily asked, her voice shaking. Before anyone could answer, we saw it. Near the edge of the lake, a dark shape was floating in the water. It was too far away to make out what it was, but it was big, too big to be an animal. Shane grabbed the flashlight and shone it toward the water. The beam revealed a large, sodden bundle, bobbing gently on the surface. "What is that?" Marcus whispered. None of us moved. None of us wanted to know. And then, as if sensing our presence, the bundle shifted and began to drift slowly toward the shore. The bundle in the water moved with an eerie slowness, as though it wasn't being carried by the gentle waves but pulled toward the shore by something unseen. We stood frozen, our eyes locked on the dark shape as it drifted closer. "Someone has to check it out," Shane finally said, though his voice betrayed his fear. "Are you insane?" Emily snapped, clutching his arm. "We don't even know what it is." "It could be someone who needs help," Shane said, glancing at the rest of us for support. Nobody volunteered. The tension in the air was thick enough to suffocate, broken only by the gentle lapping of the water against the shore. Finally, Shane sighed and grabbed the flashlight, marching toward the lake. "Stay here," he said over his shoulder, though none of us were planning to follow. He reached the water's edge, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the inky surface. The rest of us watched silently as he crouched down, his shoes sinking into the damp sand. The bundle was only a few feet away now, its features becoming clearer. It was wrapped in some kind of dark fabric, waterlogged and heavy. Shane hesitated, glancing back at us one last time before reaching into the water. "Careful," Marcus muttered under his breath, barely audible. Shane grabbed the edge of the fabric and pulled, grunting with the effort as the bundle resisted him, its weight dragging against the sand. "Help me out," he called, frustration creeping into his voice. I exchanged a glance with Marcus, and we reluctantly moved forward, our steps slow and hesitant. The bundle was heavier than I expected, and as we dragged it onto the shore, the fabric shifted, revealing something that made my stomach turn. A child's shoe, caked in mud, poked out from the edge of the bundle. Emily gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "Is that?" she started, but couldn't finish the sentence. Shane reached down, pulling at the fabric to reveal more of what was inside. But before we could see anything else, a loud, piercing scream echoed from the woods behind us. We spun around, the flashlight beams darting wildly through the trees. "Emily," I said, my voice shaking. She was gone. "Where'd she go?" Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. "She was right behind us," Shane said, his eyes wide with panic. We scanned the dark forest, calling her name, but there was no response. The scream came again, this time closer, and I realized it wasn't Emily's voice. It sounded like a child. "Back to the fire," Shane said, his voice firm. "We stick together." We abandoned the bundle on the shore, stumbling back to the campsite as quickly as we could. The fire had burned down to embers, casting only a faint glow over the clearing. "Emily," Shane called out, his voice cracking. Still no answer. I grabbed the flashlight from Shane, my hands shaking as I scanned the edges of the clearing. "Do you think?" Marcus started, but Shane cut him off. "No," he said firmly. "Don't even say it." We stood in tense silence, the only sound the distant rustling of leaves in the breeze. Then, without warning, Emily burst into the clearing, her face pale and streaked with tears. "Where were you?" Shane demanded, rushing to her side. She was shaking, her whole body trembling as she tried to catch her breath. I got lost," she stammered. "What do you mean? You were right behind us," I said, my voice rising. "I don't know," she cried, her voice breaking. "One second I was there and then I wasn't. I heard a noise, and She stopped, her eyes darting to the trees behind us. "What noise?" Shane pressed, his grip tightening on her arm. "It was laughing," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Laughing?" Marcus repeated, his face pale. She nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. It sounded like kids, but it wasn't right. It was wrong. We all stood there, too scared to speak. The forest was silent again, the only sound the faint crackling of the fire. "Maybe we should leave," Marcus said, breaking the silence. Shane shook his head. "It's too dark to hike out now. We'll stay until morning. Then we're gone." Nobody argued. We sat around the fire, huddled close together, every rustle and crack in the woods making us jump. Emily wouldn't stop shaking, her eyes darting around like she expected something, or someone, to appear at any moment. "I swear I heard them," she kept saying over and over. "They were laughing." The hours dragged by, the fire our only source of comfort. But just when I thought the night couldn't get worse, we heard it again. The laughter. It was faint at first, carried on the breeze like a half-remembered tune. But then it grew louder, sharper, like it was coming from all around us. Emily clapped her hands over her ears, rocking back and forth as she sobbed. "Make it stop," she cried. Shane grabbed a log from the fire, holding it like a torch as he stood. "Who's out there?" he shouted into the darkness. The laughter stopped. And then, from the edge of the clearing, a small figure stepped into the firelight. It was a child, no older than 6 or 7, their face pale and expressionless. They were soaking wet, their clothes clinging to their small frame, and their eyes were fixed on us, unblinking. "Help!" the child said, their voice monotone and hollow. Before we could move, another child stepped out of the woods, then another and another, until the clearing was filled with silent, soaking wet children, all staring at us. The clearing was deathly quiet. The children, if they were even real, stood motionless, their wet clothes clinging to their frail bodies, their heads tilted slightly, unblinking eyes locked onto us as though they were waiting for something. "Who are you?" Shane demanded, his voice shaking as he held the burning log out in front of him like a shield. The children didn't answer. Emily was trembling beside me, her hands clutching my sleeve so tightly I could feel her nails digging into my arm. "We should leave," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. I nodded, but my legs wouldn't move. Something about the way those children stared at us was paralyzing, like they were looking straight through us. Then one of them, the smallest, took a step forward. "Help," they said again, their voice soft and monotone, like they didn't understand the word. "Stay back," Shane barked, brandishing the log. The child stopped, their head tilting to the side in an unervingly slow motion. "Help," they repeated, their voice hollow. The tension was unbearable. Finally, Marcus took a shaky step forward, his hands raised. "They're just kids," he said, though his voice trembled with every word. "Marcus, no," I hissed, grabbing his arm. "They might need help," he said, shaking me off. He crouched down a few feet from the smallest child, his voice soft. "Are you lost? Where are your parents?" The child didn't respond. They just stared at him, their expression blank. Then they smiled. It wasn't the kind of smile you'd expect from a child. It was too slow, too deliberate, and it didn't reach their eyes. Marcus froze, his hand hovering in midair. "Come back," I whispered, my heart pounding. Before he could move, another child stepped forward, their eyes fixed on Shane's burning log. "Fire," they said, their voice flat and emotionless. Shane took a step back, his confidence faltering. "Let's go," he muttered, glancing nervously at the rest of us. Emily nodded, her face pale. We can't stay here. The children didn't move as we backed away, their unblinking eyes following our every step. When we reached the edge of the clearing, Shane turned and broke into a run, pulling Emily with him. Marcus and I followed, the sound of our frantic footsteps drowned out by the pounding of my heart. We didn't stop until we reached the lake, the dark water rippling in the faint moonlight. What the hell was that? Emily demanded, her voice shaking. Kids, Marcus said, though he didn't sound convinced. Kids don't act like that, I said, my hands trembling as I grabbed my knees, trying to catch my breath. Shane dropped the log onto the damp ground, the flames hissing as they sputtered out. We're leaving, he said, his voice firm. Now. No arguments here, Emily said, grabbing her backpack. We started packing up in silence, our eyes darting nervously to the tree line every few seconds. The forest was dark and still, but the tension in the air was suffocating, like we were being watched. As we stuffed our gear into our bags, Marcus froze, his head snapping toward the trees. Did you hear that? He whispered. We all stopped, straining to listen. First, there was nothing, just the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. Then we heard it, a faint, rhythmic sound, like something tapping against wood. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the direction of the clearing. Go, Shane said, his voice barely above a whisper. We grabbed our bags and started walking quickly down the trail, our footsteps crunching on the dirt path. The tapping followed us, growing louder with each step. I glanced over my shoulder, my stomach twisting with fear. The trail behind us was empty, but the sound was getting closer. Faster, Emily urged, breaking into a jog. The tapping turned into pounding like someone or something was running after us. We broke into a sprint, the beam of Shane's flashlight bouncing wildly as we stumbled down the narrow path. The sound was deafening now, crashing through the woods like a stampede. Then suddenly it stopped. We skidded to a halt, our breaths coming in ragged gasps as we turned to look behind us. The trail was empty. The forest was silent. What the hell is going on? Emily whispered, her voice trembling. I don't know, Shane admitted, his confidence finally cracking. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, our eyes scanning the darkness. Then Marcus spoke, his voice barely audible. They're here. He pointed to the edge of the trail, where the trees parted just enough to reveal the small, pale faces of the children. They were standing perfectly still, their wet clothes clinging to their small frames. But they weren't alone. Behind them, deeper in the shadows, were more figures. Adults. Their faces were obscured by the darkness, but their presence was unmistakable. The children stepped aside, parting like a curtain, and one of the adults stepped forward. It was a woman, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes sunken and empty. She raised a hand and pointed directly at us. You shouldn't have come here, she said, her voice cold and sharp. Before we could respond, the children and adults surged forward as one, their footsteps thunderous as they closed the distance between us. We bolted. The trail was a blur of shadows and twisting branches, our frantic footsteps pounding against the dirt as we ran. Behind us, the pounding of feet grew louder, accompanied by faint, breathless laughter that echoed through the trees. Don't stop, Shane yelled, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly. The forest felt alive, the air growing thicker with every step, the trees pressing closer like they were trying to keep us in. Emily tripped on a root, stumbling forward with a cry. Marcus grabbed her arm, pulling her upright. Come on, he urged, his voice shaking. Where does this trail go? Emily gasped, clutching her side as she struggled to keep up. It loops back to the lake, Shane said, his voice tight. No, I panted. We can't go back there. That's where this started. Then where? Marcus snapped, panic breaking through his usual calm. The laughter grew louder, sharper, cutting through the sound of our labored breaths. There was a fork in the trail earlier, I said. If we go left, it might take us back to the road. We reached the fork moments later, skidding to a stop. The left path was narrow and overgrown, barely a trail at all, but it was our only chance. "This way!" I shouted, shoving through the thorny brush. The branches tore at our clothes and skin, but we didn't care. The only thing that mattered was putting as much distance as possible between us and them. "Are they still following?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. I glanced back and immediately wished I hadn't. The children were still there, their pale faces catching the occasional flicker of moonlight through the canopy. But the adults were closer now. Their movements were wrong, jerky, and unnatural, like they were being pulled forward on strings. The woman in front led the pack, her arm outstretched, her finger pointing directly at us. "Keep running!" Shane yelled, his voice cracking with fear. We pushed forward, the trail becoming steeper and more treacherous as it twisted through the dense forest. Then, without warning, the ground beneath my feet vanished. I tumbled forward, landing hard on a steep incline that sent me sliding down through mud and leaves. "Jason!" Emily screamed as she and the others stumbled after me, unable to stop themselves. We finally came to a stop at the bottom of the slope, covered in dirt and scratches, our breaths ragged. "Is everyone okay?" Shane asked, his voice barely steady. "I think so," Emily said, wincing as she held her scraped knee. Marcus sat up, his face pale as he scanned the dark woods around us. "Where are we?" he asked. Shane pointed his flashlight toward the slope we'd fallen down. "We're off the trail," he said grimly. Emily let out a shaky breath, her eyes darting nervously between the trees. "Do you think we lost them?" The forest was silent, the oppressive stillness broken only by the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. We sat there for a few minutes, catching our breath, too afraid to move. Then we heard it, a soft, deliberate sound. Tap, tap, tap. It echoed through the trees, faint at first, but growing louder with every passing second. "Get up," Shane said, his voice urgent. We scrambled to our feet, the exhaustion in our limbs replaced by adrenaline. The tapping stopped, replaced by the faint sound of footsteps. Slow, measured, and deliberate. "They're coming," Marcus said, his voice trembling. We moved as quickly as we could, stumbling through the dense underbrush. The branches seemed thicker here, their gnarled fingers snagging at our clothes and skin. Shane led the way, the flashlight beam cutting through the dark, but the forest felt endless, every direction looking the same. "Where are we going?" Emily asked, her voice rising in panic. "I don't know," Shane snapped, his usual confidence cracking. The footsteps behind us grew louder, joined by faint whispers, too soft to make out, but undeniably there. We burst into a small clearing, the moonlight casting a pale glow over the open space. In the center stood an old, crumbling cabin, its windows shattered and its roof sagging under the weight of time. "We can hide in there," Shane said, pointing to the cabin. "Are you crazy?" Emily shot back. "That place looks like it's about to collapse. Do you have a better idea?" Shane snapped. The whispers grew louder, closer, and I made the decision for us. "Come on," I said, grabbing Emily's arm and pulling her toward the cabin. The door creaked as we pushed it open, the sound loud and jarring in the quiet night. The inside was worse than I'd imagined. The floor was covered in debris, and the air reeked of mildew and decay. But it was shelter. We huddled together in the corner, Shane propping a broken chair against the door as a weak barricade. "Do you think they saw us come in here?" Marcus asked, his voice barely audible. "I don't know," Shane admitted. We sat in silence, our breaths shallow, straining to hear any sound from outside. First there was nothing. Then, faintly, the tapping returned. It was closer now, coming from just outside the cabin. Emily whimpered, burying her face in her hands. "Shoo!" Shane whispered, holding a finger to his lips. The tapping stopped, replaced by the sound of footsteps circling the cabin. My heart pounded as I gripped a broken piece of wood, ready to defend myself if they came through the door. The footsteps stopped, and the silence was deafening. Then, from above, came the sound of something heavy dragging across the roof. Emily screamed, and Shane clamped a hand over her mouth, his eyes wide with fear. "Don't move," he whispered. We stayed frozen, listening as the dragging sound moved back and forth above us, slow and deliberate. Then it stopped, and the whispers returned, louder this time, as though they were coming from inside the cabin. Before we could react, the door creaked open, and a pale hand reached through the gap. The pale hand pushed the door open slowly, the broken chair scraping uselessly across the floor as it gave way. We froze, our breaths caught in our throats, watching as the door creaked wider. Behind it stood one of the children, their face as blank and pale as the moonlight streaming through the shattered windows. "Help," they said, their monotone voice echoing in the cramped cabin. I couldn't move. None of us could. The child stepped inside, their wet clothes dripping onto the wooden floor, leaving small, dark puddles. "Stay back," Shane said, his voice trembling as he held the broken chair leg in front of him like a weapon. The child didn't respond. They just kept walking, their unblinking eyes fixed on us. "Help," they said again, their voice softer now, almost pleading. Then another figure appeared in the doorway. And another. One by one, the children entered the cabin, their small frames filling the cramped space. I counted 6 of them before the first adult stepped inside. It was the woman we'd seen earlier, her gaunt face twisted into a chilling smile. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, her voice cold and sharp. "What do you want from us?" Emily cried, tears streaming down her face. The woman tilted her head, her smile widening. "You're trespassing," she said simply. "This is our land." The children moved closer, their bare feet silent on the floor. I gripped my makeshift weapon tighter, my hands slick with sweat. "We're sorry," Shane said, his voice cracking. "We didn't know. We'll leave right now." The woman laughed softly, a sound that sent chills down my spine. "It's too late for that," she said. The children stopped, forming a half-circle around us, their empty eyes staring us down. The woman stepped forward, her gaze locking onto me. "You shouldn't have disturbed the lake," she said. "We didn't mean to," I said quickly, my voice shaking. "We just—" "Shoo!" she interrupted, holding up a finger. Her smile disappeared, replaced by a look of cold indifference. "You need to make amends," she said. "What does that mean?" Marcus asked, his voice trembling. The woman didn't answer. Instead, she reached into the pocket of her tattered coat and pulled out a small, rusted knife. She held it out to Shane. "Choose," she said. "Choose what?" Shane asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "One of you stays," she said. "The rest can leave." My stomach dropped, and I felt the blood drain from my face. "This is insane," Emily said, shaking her head. The woman's expression didn't change. "Choose," she repeated. Shane's hand trembled as he reached for the knife, his eyes darting between the rest of us. "I'm not doing this," he said, dropping the knife onto the floor. The woman sighed, her disappointment palpable. "Then none of you leave," she said. The children moved closer, their small hands reaching out. "No!" I shouted, swinging the piece of wood wildly in front of me. The children stopped, their heads tilting in unison as they stared at me. "Jason, stop!" Emily cried, pulling me back. But I couldn't stop. The fear had taken over. I lunged at the woman, swinging the wood with all my strength. She moved faster than I thought possible, stepping aside and grabbing my wrist in one fluid motion. Her grip was like iron, and she twisted my arm until I dropped the wood. "I told you," she said, her voice calm. "You shouldn't have come here." She shoved me backward, and I fell to the floor, gasping for air. "Run!" Shane yelled, grabbing Emily and Marcus and pulling them toward the door. I scrambled to my feet, following them as the children closed in. We burst out of the cabin and into the woods, the cold night air hitting me like a slap to the face. The laughter returned, louder now, echoing all around us as we ran. The ground was uneven, the roots and rocks making every step treacherous. But we didn't stop. We couldn't. The trail reappeared ahead, and for a brief, Fleeting moment, I thought we might actually make it. Then I heard Emily scream. I turned to see her on the ground, her ankle twisted at an unnatural angle. "Help me!" she cried, reaching out as the children emerged from the trees behind her. Shane grabbed her arm, trying to pull her up, but she cried out in pain. "They're coming!" Marcus shouted, his flashlight beam catching the pale faces closing in. I ran back, grabbing Emily's other arm. "We're not leaving you," I said firmly. Together, Shane and I lifted her, carrying her between us as we stumbled down the trail. The children didn't follow this time. They just stood at the edge of the woods, watching us with those empty, unblinking eyes. We didn't stop running until we reached the parking lot. The car was still there, our salvation waiting just feet away. We piled in, slamming the doors shut and locking them. Shane fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so badly it took him 3 tries to start the engine. The headlights illuminated the trailhead, but there was no sign of the children or the woman. We didn't wait to find out if they were still there. The tires kicked up gravel as we sped away, the forest disappearing into the rearview mirror. We never went back to Raven's Hollow. Emily needed surgery for her ankle, and she refused to talk about what happened that night. Shane tried to brush it off, calling it a bad dream, but I knew he didn't believe that. As for me, I can't stop thinking about the woman's words. "You shouldn't have disturbed the lake."